Greenbrier, a name that once conjured images of verdant hills and charming cottages. Now it echoed with whispers of a tragedy. My tragedy. The air remained heavy, thick with the memory of my passing. Or should I say, my murder. The old house creaked, a symphony of settling wood and forgotten secrets. Each groan of the floorboards, each sigh of the wind through the eaves whispered my name. Elnora. Elnora, forever bound to this place, bound to seek the truth that had been buried with me. I yearned for peace, for the quiet oblivion promised in death. But fate, it seemed, had other plans for me. I was trapped, tethered to the world by unfinished business, by the chilling truth that lingered like a shroud over Greenbrier. Life in Greenbrier had been simple, predictable. I had been content, or so I believed. Married to the handsome and charming Jacob, my days had been filled with the routines of domesticity, tending the garden, preparing meals, awaiting Jacob's return from his work in the town. I recall the scent of lavender, always clinging to my fingertips from the garden. I recall the warmth of the sun on my face as I hung laundry to dry, the crisp white sheets billowing like sails in the gentle breeze. Small joys perhaps, but they had painted my world in hues of contentment, or so I had thought. It was only in death that the cracks in the facade began to show, revealing the dark truth that lurked beneath. The truth about Jacob, the truth about my life, the truth about my death. Jacob. The name sent a shiver down my spectral spine, a chill that had nothing to do with the grave. It was a name that once brought warmth and comfort, but now it only brought a haunting sense of dread. He had grieved, of course, sobbed at my funeral, his shoulders shaking with what everyone believed was remorse. But I saw the truth in his eyes, in the depths where shadows danced. Relief. A relief that was as cold as the grave I now occupied. It had started subtly, so gradually, that I, blinded by love and trust, had failed to notice. A cutting remark disguised as a joke, a dismissive wave of his hand when I spoke of my day, a coldness that seeped into his touch, replacing the warmth I had cherished. I had brushed it aside, attributing it to stress, to fatigue. I told myself that husbands and wives went through phases, that the spark would return. It never did. Instead, the shadows in his eyes grew deeper, colder, until they consumed the man I thought I knew. The man who once held me close, who whispered sweet nothings in my ear, had become a stranger with a familiar face, but a heart that had turned to ice. I remember the first time I noticed the change. It was a small thing, a fleeting moment. His eyes, once filled with love and warmth, had grown distant, cold. The shadows in his eyes seemed to dance, mocking me, taunting me with the truth I refused to see. The changes were subtle at first, a missed dinner, a forgotten anniversary, little things that I brushed off, convinced that they were just signs of a busy life. But as time went on, the signs became harder to ignore. The cutting remarks became more frequent, the dismissive gestures more pronounced. I tried to talk to him, to understand what was happening, but every time I brought it up, he would dismiss it, wave it off as if it were nothing. His touch, once so warm and comforting, had grown cold, distant. The man I loved was slipping away, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I told myself that it was just a phase, that things would get better. But deep down, I knew the truth. The man I loved was gone, replaced by a stranger with a familiar face, a stranger whose eyes were filled with shadows, whose heart had turned to ice. The coldness in his touch was a stark contrast to the warmth I had once known. It was as if the man I loved had been replaced by a ghost, a shadow of his former self. The love that once burned so brightly had faded, replaced by a darkness that consumed everything in its path. I tried to hold on, to believe that things would get better. But the shadows in his eyes told a different story. They whispered of a love that had died, of a heart that had turned to ice. The man I loved was gone, and in his place was a stranger with a familiar face. I told myself that husbands and wives went through phases, that the spark would return, but it never did. Instead, the shadows in his eyes grew deeper, colder, until they consumed the man I thought I knew. The spark that once ignited our love had faded, replaced by a darkness that consumed everything in its path. The man I loved was gone, replaced by a stranger with a familiar face. A stranger whose eyes were filled with shadows, whose heart had turned to ice. The shadows in his eyes grew deeper, colder, until they consumed the man I thought I knew. The man who once held me close, who whispered sweet nothings in my ear, had become a stranger. A stranger with a familiar face, but a heart that had turned to ice. The man I loved was gone, replaced by a stranger with a familiar face. A stranger whose eyes were filled with shadows, whose heart had turned to ice. The shadows in his eyes grew deeper, colder, until they consumed the man I thought I knew. The memories played in my mind, fragmented and haunting. The afternoon sun slanting through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. The comforting aroma of chamomile tea, a ritual we shared each day. And the bitter taste, sharp and acrid, that lingered on my tongue. It was the day I fell ill. A sudden, crippling weakness that sent me to bed, my head pounding, my stomach churning. Jacob, ever the attentive husband, had brought me tea, his brow furrowed with concern, or so I had thought. Now, as I relived that moment, a chilling realization washed over me. The taste in the tea, the way Jacob's hand had trembled ever so slightly as he offered me the cup. The look in his eyes, not of concern but of something else entirely. Triumph? Death, I soon discovered, was not an escape from life's burdens but rather a magnification of them. I became a silent observer, a prisoner in my own home, unseen and unheard. I watched as Jacob moved through the motions of mourning, his grief a carefully constructed facade. I felt a chill as he packed away my belongings, his touch rough and careless. I watched as he entertained guests, his laughter hollow and forced, and I saw the way his gaze lingered on the young widow from the next town, a predatory glint in his eyes. My anger grew, a cold and relentless fire. I wanted to scream at him, to shake him, to make him see the truth. But I was a ghost, my voice nothing more than a whisper on the wind. Time, in the spectral realm, was a fluid and unreliable thing. Days bled into nights, weeks into months. I watched as Greenbrier whispered my story, the rumors swirling like the autumn leaves. Elnora, they said, had always been sickly. A weak heart, perhaps, or a fragile constitution. But I knew the truth. And as the whispers reached a fever pitch, I knew I was not alone in my suspicions. There were those who had noticed Jacob's coldness, his haste in moving on. Those who had seen the shadows in his eyes long before I had. Hope, like a flickering candle in the darkness, ignited within me. I might be a ghost, unable to speak or touch, but perhaps, just perhaps, I could find a way to make my voice heard, to reveal the truth that Jacob had so carefully concealed. The air crackled with anticipation as the townsfolk gathered in my former parlor. The room was filled with a mix of curiosity and fear, each person wondering what the night would reveal. A hush fell over the room as the candles flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The flickering light seemed to breathe life into the very walls, making the room feel alive with unseen energies, a seance. The very word sent shivers down my spectral spine. It was a ritual that bridged the gap between the living and the dead, a doorway to the unknown. My spectral form hovered near the ceiling, unseen but acutely aware of every whispered word, every nervous glance. I could feel the tension in the room, a palpable energy that seemed to pulse with every heartbeat. Among the faces, I recognized the young widow, her eyes downcast, a flicker of guilt in their depths. She had come seeking answers, perhaps absolution, for the secrets she held close to her heart. And then, there was Jacob, his face pale and drawn, trying to mask his growing unease. His hands trembled slightly, betraying the calm facade he tried so hard to maintain. The medium, a stout woman with knowing eyes, closed her eyes and began to speak in a low, chanting voice. Her words were a melodic incantation, weaving a spell that seemed to draw the very essence of the room into her. The air grew heavy, thick with the weight of expectation. Every breath seemed to hang in the balance, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I could feel a presence, something ancient and powerful, entering the room, drawn by the collective will of the living. It was as if the very fabric of time and space had been altered, allowing this entity to cross over into our world. The room seemed to vibrate with its energy, a force that was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The room held its breath. The medium's eyes flew open, wide and unseeing. Her voice when she spoke was no longer her own, but a hollow echo resonating with an unearthly power. "Elnora," the voice rasped, sending chills down the spines of the living. "Elnora, are you here?" I wanted to scream, to shout my answer from the rooftops. Instead, I focused all my spectral energy, pouring my rage and frustration, my desperate need for justice, into a single word. Yes! The effect was instantaneous. The candles sputtered, their flames turning a sickly green. A cold wind swept through the room, chilling the air. The townsfolk gasped, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. I had their attention. Now it was time to make them understand. Through the medium I recounted my tale, my voice echoing from the beyond, a whisper carried by the winds of time. I spoke of the slow poisoning, the bitter taste of betrayal in my final cup of tea, each sip a step closer to my untimely demise, orchestrated by the one I once trusted with my life. I described the shadows in Jacob's eyes, the relief masked as grief, his facade of sorrow, a thin veil over the dark satisfaction he felt as he watched me wither away. I revealed his growing affection for the young widow, his desire to be free from the bonds of marriage, his longing for a new life, unburdened by the vows he had once made to me. With each word I could feel Jacob's composure crumbling, the weight of his guilt pressing down, cracking the mask he wore so confidently. He sputtered denials, his face contorted in a mixture of rage and fear. His voice, once so commanding, now trembled with the realization that his secrets were laid bare. But the townsfolk, their eyes wide with horror, were no longer on his side. The community that once respected him now saw the monster he truly was. The truth, like a poisonous vapor, had seeped into the room, suffocating his lies. Each revelation, a nail in the coffin of his deceit. The seance ended in chaos. The room, once filled with anticipation, now buzzed with the energy of the supernatural and the raw emotion of the living. The police were summoned, their skepticism melting away in the face of the collective testimony of the townsfolk and the chilling confirmation of the spectral presence that lingered in the air. The weight of the evidence, both seen and unseen, was undeniable. Justice, though belated, was finally within reach. Justice, though slow and agonizing, eventually prevailed. Jacob was found guilty, his carefully constructed facade crumbling under the weight of evidence and the chilling whispers of the Greenbrier ghost. As the verdict was read, I felt a weight lift from my spectral shoulders. My purpose, the reason for my lingering presence, had been served. The truth was out. Justice, though delayed, had been served. And so, with a final sigh, I bid farewell to the mortal world. The Greenbrier ghost was no more. Only the whispers of my story remained, a chilling reminder that even in death, truth has a way of coming to light, and that sometimes the walls themselves can whisper secrets to those who know how to listen.